The rice paper trembled between Maggie's fingers like a living thing. The fluorescent light above her workbench flickered, casting dancing shadows across her grandmother's impossible handwriting, each brushstroke as familiar as her own reflection, yet carrying the weight of decades she thought she understood. Popo? The childhood name escaped her lips in a whisper. Her grandmother had been gone for 70 years, dead in Manzanar when Maggie's mother was barely 14. Yet here was proof of a life that continued beyond that stark desert camp, beyond the official records that listed Lila Chen as deceased in the winter of 1943. Maggie's hands shook as she spread the delicate paper on her felt work mat. The shop around her, 20 years of carefully curated antiques, David's pottery wheel still gathering dust in the corner, the vintage cash register that never quite closed properly, all of it faded into peripheral darkness as she focused on the faded ink. The writing was in Chinese characters mixed with English, the hybrid language of immigrants caught between worlds. Maggie's Mandarin was rusty, learned in childhood Saturday schools and half forgotten through decades of assimilation, but she could make out enough to understand the urgency bleeding through each stroke. Hidden where the jade mountain meets the water. 3 steps from the weeping stone. What they took from us waits in darkness. Below that, coordinates. Numbers that meant nothing to her now but felt weighted with significance. And at the bottom, a warning that made her blood run cold. Trust no one who speaks of honor without scars. A car door slammed outside, sharp as a gunshot in the November night. Maggie's head snapped up, her pulse hammering against her throat. Through the rain-streaked window of Chen's Curiosities, she could see the black sedan still parked across the street, its engine running, exhaust visible in the cold air. How long had it been there? The question clawed at her memory as she tried to reconstruct the evening. She'd been so focused on the bonsai, on the strange metallic lump that had called to her from the storage unit like a siren song. The tree now sat on her workbench, its ancient trunk split open, revealing the hollow where secrets had nested for 8 decades. The storage auction felt like a lifetime ago, though it had been only hours since she'd handed over $300 she couldn't afford to lose. Unit 47 had been full of the detritus of someone's life. Boxes of moldering books, furniture that might have been valuable once, the kind of forgotten treasures that made her profession possible. But the previous owner was dead, the auctioneer had said, no next of kin. Everything must go. She hadn't asked how he died. In her business, you learn not to dig too deep into the stories behind the objects. Everyone's tragedy was someone else's opportunity. But now, staring at her grandmother's message, Maggie wondered if she should have asked more questions. The previous owner's name had been Walter Yamamoto, according to the paperwork. Japanese-American like her grandmother, born in the same year Lila Chen had supposedly died. The fluorescent light flickered again, and in the stroboscopic darkness, Maggie saw movement across the street, a figure in the sedan's driver's seat, leaning forward, watching. The glow of what might have been a camera or phone screen illuminated a face she couldn't quite make out. Her fingers found her cell phone before conscious thought kicked in. Who could she call? The police would think she was paranoid. Her few remaining friends had their own problems, their own bills and marriages and midnight anxieties. David would have known what to do, would have wrapped his potter's arms around her and made the world feel manageable again. But David had been gone for 2 years, taking with him not just love, but the luxury of shared decisions. The medical bills from his cancer treatment sat in a neat stack on her desk, each envelope a small paper tombstone marking another piece of their life together. The shop was supposed to have been their retirement plan, their hedge against uncertainty. Instead, it had become her albatross, bleeding money she didn't have to keep alive, memories she couldn't afford to lose. But this message from a ghost might change everything. Maggie carefully photographed the rice paper with her phone, then slid it into a protective sleeve meant for delicate documents, whatever her grandmother had hidden. Whoever was watching her shop, one thing was certain: her quiet life of estate sales and gentle deception, calling reproduction furniture vintage, aging new pieces to look older, was over. She moved to the front window and peered through the Venetian blinds. The sedan's headlights flared to life, cutting through the rain like accusations. As she watched, it pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the Portland night, leaving only questions and the growing certainty that some inheritances came with a price she was only beginning to understand. The bonsai tree watched from her workbench, its wounded trunk gaping like an accusation, like a promise, like the first crack in a wall that had been holding back decades of secrets. Maggie stood frozen at the window long after the sedan's taillights vanished into the rain-slicked darkness. The silence that followed felt heavier than the watching had been, thick with implications she wasn't ready to name. She let the Venetian blinds snap back into place and turned to survey her kingdom of accumulated sorrows. Chen's curiosities looked exactly as it had 12 hours ago, but everything felt different now. The Tiffany lamp, authentic, a rare find from an estate in the Pearl District, cast the same warm glow over the mahogany display case. The collection of Depression-era glassware still caught light like frozen tears on their corner shelf. Even the smell remained unchanged: lemon oil, old wood, and the faint mustiness that clung to objects that had outlived their original owners. But the bonsai tree squatted on her workbench like an intruder at a tea party, its split trunk revealing the hollow where her grandmother's message had waited for 8 decades. Maggie approached it cautiously, as if it might speak again, might offer more impossible truths to shatter what remained of her carefully constructed reality. The tree was magnificent despite its wound, or perhaps because of it. The bark was weathered to silver gray, twisted into patterns that spoke of centuries of patient cultivation. Each branch had been shaped with the kind of dedication that spanned generations, the artistic vision of masters who understood that beauty often required sacrifice. Her phone buzzed against the workbench. A text from Elena, her only remaining employee, though employee was generous for someone she could only afford to pay 15 hours a week. Late shipment from the Hawthorne estate came in. Books looked promising. Chinese poetry collections, some really old stuff. Thought you'd want to see before I priced them. Maggie stared at the message, struck by the coincidence. Chinese poetry. Today of all days. She typed back quickly, "Can you come in early tomorrow? Need to show you something?" The response was immediate. "Everything okay? You sound weird." Elena Martinez was 26, art history degree from Reed College, and possessed the kind of sharp intuition that made her invaluable in the antique trade. She could spot a reproduction Stickley chair from across a crowded estate sale and had an uncanny ability to research the provenance of mysterious objects. More importantly, she was the closest thing Maggie had to family now, chosen family, forged from shared passion for beautiful old things and the stories they carried. "I'm fine, just tired. Long day at the auctions. Did you score anything good? Your text sounds like Christmas morning." Maggie's eyes drifted to the bonsai, to the protective sleeve containing her grandmother's message. How could she explain this? How could she tell Elena that everything she thought she knew about her family history had just been rewritten by a dead woman's hand? Maybe. We'll see. She set the phone aside and walked to her desk, where the medical bills waited in their neat stack beside David's final insurance settlement paperwork. $12,000 in debt, not counting the shop's overhead. Rent due in 2 weeks. The vintage cash register that never quite closed properly seemed to mock her with its broken finality. This was her ordinary world, the daily calculation of which bills could wait another month, which creditors would accept partial payments, which estate sales might yield the one piece valuable enough to buy her breathing room. She'd become an expert at gentle deception, not just with customers, but with herself. Each morning brought the same ritual: coffee too strong to mask the taste of fear, a walk through the shop to count her remaining treasures, and the careful maintenance of hope that today might be the day someone walked through her door with money, to spend on beauty instead of necessity. The irony wasn't lost on her. She dealt in objects that had survived their owners, that carried the weight of other people's histories, yet she couldn't seem to secure her own future. Every piece she sold was a small betrayal of the vision she and David had shared, that their shop would be a sanctuary for beauty, a place where the past lived on in capable hands. Now she faced a choice that would have been impossible yesterday. Her grandmother's message promised something hidden, something valuable enough that people had died protecting its secret. The coordinates meant nothing to her yet, but she recognized possibility when it pressed itself against her palms like rice paper soft with age. The shop's grandfather clock chimed 11, its brass pendulum catching light as it swung through shadows. Maggie had inherited the clock from the shop's previous owner, along with the lease and a reputation built on 40 years of fair dealing. Mrs. Patterson had been 93 when she decided to retire, her arthritis finally winning the battle against her passion for beautiful things. The hardest part, Mrs. Patterson had told her during the transition, isn't finding treasures. It's knowing when to let them go. Maggie understood now that some treasures came with prices that couldn't be calculated in dollars. As she prepared to lock up for the night, she couldn't shake the feeling that her grandmother's message was both salvation and trap, gift and burden, the kind of inheritance that changed everything, whether you wanted it to or not. The morning brought no relief from the questions that had circled Maggie's mind like vultures through the sleepless hours. She arrived at Chen's Curiosities before dawn, her key turning in the lock with the familiar reluctance of old hardware that had seen too many openings and closings. The shop welcomed her with its usual silence, but even the comfort of routine felt fragile now. She'd moved Bonsai tree to the back room after closing, unable to bear its presence on the main floor where customers might ask questions she couldn't answer. Now it sat beside her desk like a guilty secret, its wounded trunk a constant reminder that her ordinary world had already begun to crack. Elena arrived with coffee and the sharp energy that made her indispensable. "You look like hell," she announced, setting a steaming cup beside Maggie's keyboard. "What's going on? And don't say nothing because I can read your face like a book." Before Maggie could formulate an answer, the bell above the front door chimed. Both women turned to see a man in an expensive charcoal coat stepping carefully around a Ming vase reproduction, his eyes scanning the shop with the methodical attention of someone conducting inventory. "Good morning." His voice carried the slight formality of someone for whom English was a second language, though his accent was so faint Maggie couldn't place its origin. "I'm looking for Margaret Chen." "That's me." Maggie moved to the front of the store, Elena trailing behind with the predatory alertness she reserved for difficult customers. "How can I help you?" The man was perhaps 60, with silver hair precisely cut and hands that had never known manual labor. His coat was cashmere, his shoes Italian leather, and everything about him suggested the kind of wealth that made antique shopping a hobby rather than a necessity. "My name is James Nakamura," he said, producing a business card from his inner pocket. "I represent certain collectors with interests in Japanese artifacts. I understand you acquired some items yesterday from a storage auction." The words hit Maggie like ice water. "I'm sorry, how did you—" Word travels quickly in our community when pieces of historical significance surface. His smile was practiced, professional, and utterly without warmth. "The previous owner, Walter Yamamoto, was known to us. His collection contained items of particular cultural importance." Elena stepped closer, her body language shifting into protection mode. "Are you looking for something specific?" Nakamura's attention remained fixed on Maggie, a bonsai tree. Quite old, possibly centuries, it would have been the centerpiece of Mr. Yamamoto's collection. The air in the shop seemed to thicken. Maggie felt her grandmother's message burning against her consciousness like a brand. "I'm afraid I don't discuss my inventory with strangers. If you're interested in making a purchase, you're welcome to look around." "Mrs. Chen." His voice carried a weight that made her name sound like a warning. "Some artifacts carry significance beyond their monetary value. The tree I'm seeking has been in my client's family for generations. It was misplaced during the war years. We're prepared to offer substantial compensation for its return." "Misplaced," Elena repeated, her tone sharp enough to cut glass. "That's an interesting word choice." Nakamura's eyes flicked to Elena with undisguised irritation before returning to Maggie. "These wartime dislocations were tragic for many families. My clients have spent decades trying to recover what was lost. Surely you can understand the desire to reclaim one's heritage." Maggie's mouth went dry. The man standing in her shop knew exactly what she'd found, possibly knew more about her grandmother's message than she did. I'm afraid I can't help you. I don't have any bonsai trees for sale. Perhaps you haven't had time to properly catalog yesterday's acquisitions. He reached into his coat again, this time producing a thick envelope. $5,000, Mrs. Chen, cash, for a tree that, according to public records, cost you $300 at auction. The number hung in the air between them like a dare. $5,000 would cover 2 months' rent and make a significant dent in David's medical bills. It was more money than she'd seen at once since the insurance settlement. That's quite generous, she managed, her voice steadier than her hands. But as I said, I don't have what you're looking for. Nakamura's professional smile never wavered, but something cold flickered behind his eyes. I see. Perhaps you need time to consider. I'll be in Portland for several days. He placed the envelope on her counter. My phone number is on my card. When you're ready to discuss this reasonably, please call. He turned to leave, then paused at the door. Mrs. Chen, some family histories are more complicated than we'd like to believe. Sometimes it's better to let sleeping dogs lie, as you Americans say. The bell chimed again as he disappeared into the gray morning, leaving behind the scent of expensive cologne and the envelope full of money. Maggie stared at it, feeling the weight of a choice she wasn't ready to make. What the hell was that about? Elena demanded. Maggie looked at her young partner, then at the envelope, then toward the back room where her grandmother's impossible message waited. The ordinary world she'd known for 52 years was crumbling, and she could either fight to preserve its comfortable lies or follow the truth wherever it led. Maggie's hands trembled as she picked up the envelope, its weight far heavier than mere paper and cash should be. $5,000. The number echoed in her mind like a mantra, like a prayer, like the answer to every sleepless night spent calculating which bills could wait another month. Maggie? Elena's voice seemed to come from very far away. Are you going to tell me what's happening, or do I have to guess? The envelope felt warm against Maggie's palms, as if the money inside carried its own fever. She could pay the rent, clear the largest medical bill, buy herself breathing room for the first time since David's funeral. All she had to do was hand over a tree, a beautiful, ancient tree that wasn't really hers anyway, that she'd stumbled across by accident in a storage unit full of a dead man's possessions. Except it wasn't just a tree anymore. It was her grandmother's voice reaching across 8 decades. It was impossible handwriting on rice paper that should have crumbled to dust before Maggie was even born. It was coordinates to something hidden, something valuable enough that well-dressed strangers appeared in her shop before she'd even finished her first cup of coffee. I need to show you something, Maggie said finally, leading Elena toward the back room. Her feet felt leaden, each step a small betrayal of the safe, predictable life she'd been trying so hard to preserve. The bonsai tree sat where she'd left it, its split trunk gaping like a wound that refused to heal. Elena stopped short when she saw it, her sharp intake of breath cutting through the morning silence. Jesus, Maggie. What did you do to it? I found something inside. Maggie retrieved the protective sleeve from her desk drawer, her hand still shaking as she extracted the rice paper. Look at the date. Look at the name. Elena leaned closer, her art history training kicking in as she examined the document without touching it. Maggie watched her face change, watched understanding dawn like a slow sunrise, followed immediately by the kind of confusion that made smart people doubt their own eyes. This is impossible, Elena whispered. Your grandmother died in 1943. You told me the story, the internment camp, the illness, your mother growing up an orphan. That's what I was told. The words tasted like ashes in Maggie's mouth. That's what I believed for 52 years. Elena straightened, her sharp mind already working through implications. Who was Walter Yamamoto, the previous owner of the storage unit? I don't know. But he was Japanese-American, born the same year as my grandmother, according to the paperwork. Maggie sank into her desk chair, suddenly exhausted by the weight of questions she wasn't equipped to answer. Someone's been watching the shop, Elena. Last night, after I found this, a black sedan across the street. And now this Nakamura guy shows up with enough money to save your business, wanting the exact tree you just cut open. Elena's voice carried the edge it got when she was thinking through a particularly complex authentication problem. That's not a coincidence. Maggie looked at the envelope still clutched in her hands. $5,000. Enough to buy time, to breathe, to stop the daily arithmetic of survival that had become her existence. All she had to do was give up a tree and a mystery that might destroy everything she thought she knew about her family. What if it's true? She asked, more to herself than to Elena. What if my grandmother survived? What if everything my mother told me was a lie? Then you have every right to find out why. Elena's voice was fierce with conviction. But you also have the right to walk away, to take the money and let sleeping dogs lie like he said. The phrase made Maggie's skin crawl. Let sleeping dogs lie, as if the truth were something dangerous, something that bit when disturbed, as if some secrets were meant to stay buried forever. She thought of her mother, who died 10 years ago without ever speaking of her own childhood, except in the vaguest terms. It was hard, she'd always said, when Maggie asked about the internment camps, about losing her mother so young. I don't like to remember. And Maggie had respected that silence, had built her understanding of her family history on fragments and assumptions. Now she wondered what else had been hidden in that silence. What other truths had been buried with her mother, deemed too dangerous or too painful to share? The shop's phone rang, jarring them both back to the present. Elena moved to answer it, but Maggie caught her arm. Let it go to voicemail, she said. I need to think. The phone rang again, then stopped. In the silence that followed, Maggie could hear her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of a decision that would change everything or nothing, depending on her courage. The envelope sat heavy in her lap, full of easy answers and comfortable compromises. But her grandmother's message lay on the desk between them, fragile as butterfly wings, and just as impossible to ignore. Maggie stared at her grandmother's message for a long moment, the delicate rice paper trembling slightly in the shop's old heating system. The coordinates seemed to pulse with possibility. 7.606 2° N, 122.332 1° W. Numbers that meant nothing to her, yet everything to someone willing to kill for them. I'm going to find out what's hidden there, she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. The words felt foreign in her mouth, like speaking a language she'd never learned. Elena's eyes widened. Maggie. No. The firmness in her own voice surprised her. I spent 10 years respecting my mother's silence about our family. 10 years accepting fragments and half-truths because it was easier than pushing for answers. I won't spend whatever time I have left wondering what else was buried with her. She stood, her legs unsteady but determined, and walked to the envelope of cash. For a moment she held it and her grandmother's message side by side, the weight of financial security in one hand, the weight of truth in the other. This money comes with strings, she continued, her voice growing stronger with each word. Nakamura didn't offer $5,000 out of generosity. He offered it because whatever my grandmother hid is worth far more than that. Or because it's dangerous, Elena said quietly. Maggie, someone murdered Walter Yamamoto. That's what you think, isn't it? That he didn't just die, that he was killed for protecting this secret. The thought had been circling Maggie's mind since Nakamura left, a dark possibility she hadn't wanted to voice. But Elena was right. You didn't offer a stranger $5,000 for a tree worth $300, unless the stakes were impossibly high. Maybe, Maggie admitted. But I can't live the rest of my life wondering. I can't keep this shop afloat by selling pieces of my family's history to people who think money buys the right to bury truth. She walked to the computer on her desk, her fingers clumsy on the keyboard as she typed in the coordinates. Elena moved closer, watching over her shoulder as a map materialized on the screen. Seattle, Elena breathed. The coordinates point to Seattle. Specifically, she leaned closer, her finger tracing the screen. The International District. Chinatown International District, to be precise. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs. Her grandmother's message was leading her north, to a city she'd visited only twice in her life, to a neighborhood she barely knew. The coordinates pointed to a specific address on South Jackson Street, a building that looked ordinary and unremarkable in the satellite image. "It's a 3-hour drive," Elena said. "We could be there and back by evening." "We?" Maggie turned to look at her. "Elena, you don't understand what you're volunteering for. If Nakamura is willing to pay $5,000 to make this disappear, imagine what he'll do if he finds out we're actively pursuing it. Then we don't let him find out." Elena's jaw was set with the same stubborn determination Maggie had seen her use to authenticate a disputed Ming vase. "Besides, you think I'm letting you drive to Seattle alone to chase down a mystery that's already gotten one person killed? Not happening." The shop's phone rang again, shrill and insistent. This time, Maggie didn't stop Elena from answering it. "Chen's Curiosities," Elena said in her professional voice, then paused, her expression shifting to concern. "I'm sorry, who is this?" "No, Mrs. Chen isn't available right now. May I take a message?" Another pause, longer this time. Elena's free hand found Maggie's arm, her grip tight with warning. "I see. And you're calling because?" "No, I think there's been some misunderstanding. Mrs. Chen doesn't have any Japanese artifacts for sale." "Yes, I'm certain." "Thank you." She hung up, her face pale. That was someone claiming to represent a private collector. "Wanted to know if we had any bonsai trees, specifically mentioned one that might have belonged to the Yamamoto family. Said they'd heard through channels that we'd acquired some items from a recent estate." Estate. Maggie's mouth tasted like copper. Walter Yamamoto's death wasn't natural causes, was it? They're calling it an estate because that's cleaner than calling it a crime scene. The weight of her decision settled over her like a physical thing, heavy and irrevocable. She was standing at the edge of her known world, looking across a chasm that would separate her forever from the woman she'd been yesterday. The woman who paid bills and worried about rent and accepted other people's versions of her family's truth. "I'm closing the shop for the day," she announced, moving to flip the sign on the front door. "We're going to Seattle." Elena grabbed her purse and car keys without hesitation. "What about Nakamura? What if he comes back?" Maggie looked one last time at the envelope of money, then deliberately placed it in her desk drawer. When she emerged from this, if she emerged, she wanted to do so on her own terms. "Then he'll learn that some things can't be bought," she said, following Elena toward the back exit. "And some secrets refuse to stay buried, no matter how much money you throw at them." The alley behind her shop had never felt so much like a threshold, the gray Portland sky never so much like a door closing forever on the life she used to know. The alley behind Chen's Curiosities smelled of wet concrete and old grease from the restaurant dumpsters. But as Maggie stepped into the gray morning light, she caught something else, cigarette smoke still fresh. She froze, her hand still on the back door's handle. "What is it?" Elena whispered, keys jangling softly in her grip. Maggie nodded toward the mouth of the alley, where it opened onto the side street. A figure in a dark coat stood beside the black sedan she'd spotted the night before, no longer bothering to hide. Even from 50 yards away, she could see the red ember of his cigarette and the deliberate way he watched them. "They're not even pretending anymore," she breathed. Elena's jaw tightened. "My car's in the other direction. Employee parking behind the bakery." She started moving, her steps casual but purposeful. "Just keep walking. Don't look back." They emerged onto Pine Street like two women heading out for coffee, but Maggie could feel eyes on her back like a physical weight. Elena's ancient Honda Civic sat wedged between two delivery trucks, its faded blue paint almost invisible in the morning shadows. "Get in," Elena said, already sliding behind the wheel. "We'll figure out the rest once we're moving." The engine coughed twice before catching, and Maggie held her breath until they pulled into traffic. In the side mirror, she watched the black sedan remain stationary for several seconds before slowly beginning to follow. "Elena," she said, her voice tight with fear she was trying not to feel. "I see him." Elena's hands were steady on the wheel, but her knuckles were white. "Let's see how committed he really is." Instead of heading north toward the freeway, Elena turned east, winding through the industrial district in a series of seemingly random turns. The sedan stayed with them through the first few, then began to fall back as Elena's local knowledge became an advantage. She knew which streets were one way, which intersections had long lights, which routes would take them through the maze of warehouses and shipping facilities that sprawled along the river. "There," Elena said with satisfaction as they emerged onto McLaughlin Boulevard with no sign of pursuit. "Amateur hour. Probably never been to Portland before yesterday." Maggie felt her heartbeat slowly returning to normal, but the encounter had crystallized something important. This wasn't just about money or antiques anymore. Someone was actively tracking her movements, which meant whatever her grandmother had hidden was worth far more than $5,000. "Elena," she said as they merged onto I-5 North, "I need you to understand something. Once we find whatever's at those coordinates, there's no going back. If my grandmother really did survive, if everything I believed about my family is wrong, that changes everything. Maybe that's not such a bad thing." Elena glanced over at her. "Maggie, in the 2 years I've worked for you, you've never talked about your family except in the past tense, like your history was something that happened to other people and got handed down to you secondhand. Maybe it's time you found out who you really are." The words hit harder than Maggie expected. She'd spent so much of her life accepting other people's versions of her story. Her mother's careful silence about the internment years, David's optimistic certainty that the medical bills would somehow work themselves out, even her own assumption that struggling to survive was simply the hand she'd been dealt. But her grandmother's message suggested a different story entirely, not just survival, but active resistance. Not just victimhood, but agency. The coordinates weren't random, they were deliberate, chosen by someone who'd had the foresight to hide something valuable and the hope that someday someone would come looking. As they crossed the Columbia River into Washington, Maggie's phone buzzed with a text message. "Unknown number, Mrs. Chen. I hope you'll reconsider our conversation. Some doors, once opened, can't be closed again. J. Nakamura." "He's got my cell number," she said, showing Elena the screen. "Block him. What if he has information I need? What if he knows something about my grandmother, about what really happened during the war? Then he can share it without threatening you." Elena's voice was sharp with protective anger. "Maggie, that text isn't a friendly warning. It's intimidation. He's telling you that pursuing this will have consequences." The Seattle skyline appeared ahead of them like a promise or a threat, its familiar towers shrouded in the same gray mist that seemed to follow them north from Portland. Somewhere, in that sprawling city, at coordinates her grandmother had hidden inside a living tree, waited answers that people were willing to kill for. Maggie turned off her phone and slipped it into her purse. Whatever consequences Nakamura was threatening, she was already committed to facing them. The woman who'd driven to a storage auction in desperation 3 days ago wouldn't have recognized the woman now heading towards Seattle to confront 80-year-old secrets. But then again, that woman hadn't known her grandmother's real story yet. The approach. The Seattle traffic thickened around them as they approached the International District, transforming their Honda into just another anonymous vehicle in the urban stream. Maggie found herself grateful for the anonymity, even as her nerves tightened with each passing block. The coordinates had seemed abstract on her computer screen back in Portland, just numbers pointing to somewhere else. Now, as Elena navigated the familiar grid of streets, the destination felt increasingly real and increasingly dangerous. "There," Elena said, pointing through the windshield. "South Jackson Street. We're close." The neighborhood was a mixture of old and new, traditional storefronts with Chinese and Japanese signage nestled between modern condos and trendy restaurants. It was the kind of place where history lived in layers, where the present couldn't quite erase the past. Maggie wondered if that was intentional, if her grandmother had chosen these coordinates precisely because they represented continuity across generations. "Turn left here," Maggie said, consulting the printout they'd made before leaving Portland. Her hands were steadier now, though her heart still hammered against her ribs. "It should be halfway down the block." Elena slowed the car as they approached the address. The building that materialized was unremarkable, a 3-story brick structure with a small market on the ground floor and what appeared to be apartments above. Red paper lanterns hung from the shop's awning, swaying gently in the afternoon breeze. Nothing about it suggested it held secrets worth killing for. Yamamoto Market, Elena read from the faded sign above the door. Jesus, Maggie. Do you think— Walter's family, Maggie finished, the connection hitting her like a physical blow. This isn't just where she hid something. This is where she hid it with people she trusted. They sat in the car for a long moment, watching pedestrians move past the market's windows. An elderly Japanese woman emerged carrying a bag of groceries, followed by a young mother with 2 children who switched effortlessly between English and what sounded like Japanese as they walked. The scene was so normal, so peaceful, that it felt almost obscene to think violence had touched this place. "We can't just sit here," Elena said finally. "If Nakamura's people are any good at their job, they'll figure out we left town eventually. And if they know about the coordinates, they'll end up here too." Maggie opened her car door, decision crystallizing into action. Whatever my grandmother hid, we find it first. The market's interior was narrow but deep, its shelves packed with an eclectic mixture of Asian groceries, household items, and what appeared to be family photographs spanning several decades. The smell of green tea and incense hung in the air, undercut by something more complex, the accumulated scent of years, of lives lived and stories told within these walls. A man in his 60s emerged from behind the counter as they entered, his expression polite but curious. His eyes lingered on Maggie's face with a recognition that made her skin prickle. "May I help you?" he asked, his accent suggesting English wasn't his first language, though his words were perfectly clear. Maggie found herself tongue-tied. How did you approach a stranger and explain that your supposedly dead grandmother had left coordinates pointing to their family business? How did you ask about secrets that might have gotten someone killed without sounding insane? "We're looking for information about Walter Yamamoto," Elena said when Maggie's silence stretched too long. "We believe he may have been keeping something for the Chen family, something very old." The man's expression shifted subtly, becoming more guarded. "Walter was my uncle. He passed away last month." He paused, studying Maggie's face more intently. "You said Chen family. Are you Margaret Chen?" The sound of her full name in his voice sent a chill down Maggie's spine. "You know who I am?" "Uncle Walter told me someone might come." The man moved to the shop's front door and turned the sign to closed, then gestured toward a narrow staircase at the back of the store. He said if a Chen woman came asking questions, I should show her what he'd been keeping safe. "My name is David Yamamoto. Please follow me." As they climbed the stairs, Maggie felt the weight of approaching revelation like a physical thing pressing against her chest. Each step took her further from the life she'd known and closer to truths that would reshape everything. Behind her, Elena's breathing was slightly labored. Whether from the climb or from tension, Maggie couldn't tell. The apartment above the market was small but comfortable, filled with the kind of furniture that spoke of lives carefully built and maintained across decades. David led them to a bedroom that had been converted into an office, its walls lined with filing cabinets and boxes that suggested meticulous record-keeping. "Uncle Walter spent his last years organizing family papers," David explained, pulling a key from his pocket. "He said the war scattered too many stories, broke too many connections. He didn't want anything else to be lost." He unlocked one of the filing cabinets and withdrew a manila envelope, thick with documents and photographs. When he turned to hand it to Maggie, his expression was grave. "He also said that when this day came, I should warn you, some people don't want these stories told." Maggie's hands trembled as she accepted the envelope, its weight somehow both insignificant and monumental. The manila paper was soft with age, and she could feel the bulk of documents inside, documents that Walter Yamamoto had died protecting. The thought made her fingers tighten involuntarily around the edges. "What kind of stories?" Elena asked, her voice barely above a whisper. David's eyes never left Maggie's face. "Stories about what really happened during the war. About the people who helped families survive when the government failed them. About networks that moved money and information and sometimes people themselves." He paused, seeming to weigh his words carefully. "Your grandmother was part of something much larger than you've been told." The room suddenly felt too small, the air too thick. Maggie sank into a chair by the window, the envelope heavy in her lap. Through the glass, she could see the street below. Ordinary people going about ordinary lives, unaware that secrets capable of reshaping history were being revealed just above their heads. "I need to know," she said, her voice stronger than she felt. "I need to know everything." "Then you should read this first." David withdrew another document from the filing cabinet, this one a single sheet of paper covered in careful handwriting. "Uncle Walter wrote it last month, when he started getting phone calls from strangers asking about your family. He knew someone would come looking, and he wanted to be sure you understood the stakes." Maggie unfolded the paper with hands that felt disconnected from her body. Walter's handwriting was precise, the words of a man who'd had time to choose them carefully. "Margaret Chen, if you are reading this, then I am dead, and the secret your grandmother entrusted to my family has become dangerous again. The documents in this envelope will tell you who she really was, not the victim of history you've been told about, but an active participant in resistance networks that saved hundreds of lives during and after the internment. She didn't die in the camps. She escaped, and she spent the rest of her life protecting others who were still running." Maggie's vision blurred. The words seemed to swim on the page, rearranging themselves into impossibilities. Her grandmother, quiet, defeated, dead at 23, had been part of a resistance network, had escaped, had lived beyond the official death that had shaped 3 generations of family grief. "This isn't possible," she whispered. But even as she said it, pieces began falling into place. Her mother's strange silences about family history, the way certain questions had always been deflected or ignored, the fact that official records about her grandmother had always been frustratingly vague. Elena moved closer, reading over her shoulder. "Maggie, look at the date on this letter." Maggie's eyes found the top of the page. Walter had written it just 3 weeks ago, 2 weeks before his supposed natural death. The timing wasn't coincidental. "He knew they were coming for him," David said quietly. "The phone calls started about a month ago. People claiming to be historians, genealogists, collectors, all asking the same questions about wartime documents and whether our family had preserved any records from the internment period. Uncle Walter had dealt with legitimate researchers before. These weren't legitimate." "Who were they?" Elena asked. "We don't know, but Uncle Walter recognized the danger. He'd seen it before, in the 70s, when some of the resistance networks were first discovered by people who wanted to discredit them. People with money and political connections who preferred the official version of history to the complicated truth." Maggie forced herself to continue reading Walter's letter. "The coordinates your grandmother hid were not random. They were a backup plan, created by people who understood that truth has enemies. What she protected could expose networks that helped thousands of people escape persecution, networks that powerful families want erased because their own wartime profiteering would be exposed by contrast. You have a choice to make. You can take what's in this envelope and disappear, living safely with knowledge you never share, or you can decide that some truths are worth the risk of telling." The letter continued, but Maggie's hands were shaking too hard to focus on the words. Everything she'd believed about her family, about her place in the world, was crumbling and rebuilding itself simultaneously. Her grandmother hadn't died young and powerless. She'd lived long enough to create contingency plans, to protect evidence, to ensure that someday the truth might surface. A sound from the street below made David move to the window. His expression tightened as he looked down. "There's a black sedan parked across from the market," he said. "2 men inside. They've been there for the past 5 minutes, and they don't look like customers." Maggie's blood turned to ice water. "They found us." "There's a back exit," David said, already moving toward a door she hadn't noticed. "It leads to the alley behind the building. Your car is parked in front," Elena finished grimly. The weight of the envelope in Maggie's hands suddenly felt like the weight of 3 generations of silence, of carefully buried truth, of secrets that people were willing to kill for. Her grandmother's real story was finally within reach, but reaching for it meant crossing a line from which there would be no return. The sound of car doors slamming echoed from the street below. "Move. Now." David's voice cut through Maggie's paralysis like a blade. She clutched the envelope to her chest as they rushed toward the back exit, Elena's hand firm on her elbow. Behind them, the sound of the market's front door chime seemed to echo like a warning bell. They had seconds, maybe less. The back stairs were narrow and steep, more like a fire escape than a proper exit. As they descended, Maggie could hear voices from inside the building, calm, professional voices that somehow made her skin crawl more than shouting would have. "My car's 2 blocks north," David whispered as they reached the alley. "Elena, your keys." "What?" "They'll be watching your car. Leave it. We take mine." His eyes were hard with a determination that reminded Maggie suddenly of his uncle's careful handwriting, the decades of secrets kept safe. "Elena, give me your keys and phone. Now." Elena's face went white as understanding hit. "They're tracking us. Everything digital can be tracked." David pocketed her phone and keys, then held out his hand to Maggie. "Yours too. But you need to stay alive." David's voice was gentle but implacable. "Whatever your grandmother, protected. It dies with you if you don't survive the next hour." With numb fingers, Maggie surrendered her phone. The small device felt like a lifeline being severed. Without it, she was truly cut off from everything familiar, everything safe. She was betting her life on a stranger's promise and an envelope full of impossible truths. They moved through the alley in single file, David leading them through a maze of dumpsters and service entrances. The Seattle afternoon had turned gray and cold, the kind of weather that made shadows deeper and hiding places scarcer. Every footstep seemed too loud, every breath too visible in the chill air. There, David pointed to a rust-colored Honda Civic parked behind a restaurant. "That's mine." As they approached the car, Maggie's grip on the envelope tightened. Inside was everything, her grandmother's real story, evidence of networks that had saved lives, proof that her family's history was far more complex than she'd ever imagined. It was also, apparently, worth killing for. "David," she started, then stopped as the weight of what she was about to ask hit her. This man owed her nothing. His uncle was already dead, his family already in danger. She had no right to drag him deeper into whatever was hunting them. "What?" He was already unlocking the car, checking the street beyond the alley with the practiced awareness of someone who understood real danger. "Why are you helping us? You could just give them the envelope and tell them we were never here." David's hand stilled on the car door. For a moment, the only sound was Elena's sharp breathing and the distant hum of traffic from the main street. "Because 60 years ago, your grandmother helped my mother escape from people who would have killed her for the crime of falling in love with a white soldier," he said quietly. "Because Uncle Walter spent his whole life protecting the stories of people who fought back when fighting back meant everything. Because some debts don't die with the people who owed them." As they slid into the Honda, Maggie felt the full weight of inherited obligation settling on her shoulders. This wasn't just about her family's secrets anymore. It was about honoring the courage of people who'd risked everything to preserve truth for a future they might not live to see. David started the engine just as shouts erupted from the direction of the market. Through the Honda's rear window, Maggie could see figures moving in the alley behind them, purposeful, coordinated, closing in. "Hold on," David said, and gunned the engine. They shot out of the alley onto a side street, tires squealing on the damp asphalt. In the side mirror, Maggie watched the black sedan emerge from behind the market, already turning to follow. The pursuit was no longer subtle. They'd moved past intimidation into open chase. "Elena," Maggie said. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry I dragged you into this." "Don't." Elena's voice was tight but determined. "Don't you dare apologize for finally fighting back." But as the sedan gained on them through the Seattle traffic, Maggie felt the crushing weight of having lost everything that mattered. Her business was gone. She couldn't go back to Portland now. Her life was gone. She was a fugitive, running from forces she didn't understand with evidence she might never be able to use. Elena's safety was gone. Her friend and employee was now as much a target as Maggie herself. The envelope in her hands contained her grandmother's real story, but pursuing that truth might have cost them any chance of living to tell it. They were cut off, isolated, running blind through a city where enemies had already found them once. The dark sedan was gaining ground, and Maggie realized with crystalline clarity that sometimes the truth wasn't enough. Sometimes courage wasn't enough. Sometimes everything you fought to protect could be lost in the space between one heartbeat and the next. The sedan was 3 car lengths behind when David yanked the wheel hard right, sending them careening down a steep residential street lined with parked cars. The Honda's engine screamed in protest as he downshifted, using the steep grade to break visual contact with their pursuers. "There's something else," he said, his voice tight with concentration as he navigated the narrow street. "Something Uncle Walter made me promise to tell you only if we were being chased." Maggie's grip on the envelope tightened. "What?" "Your grandmother didn't just escape the camps. She worked with the OSS, the precursor to the CIA. Some of the people hunting you aren't trying to bury resistance networks. They're trying to bury evidence that the US government was running its own networks inside the camps, using internees as intelligence assets." The words hit Maggie like a physical blow. Elena twisted in her seat, staring at David with undisguised horror. "You're saying her grandmother was a spy?" "I'm saying she was recruited by people who promised to protect other families if she gathered intelligence on suspected sympathizers and saboteurs within the camps." David took another sharp turn, his eyes constantly checking the mirrors. She agreed because she thought she was saving lives. She only learned later that her intelligence was being used to identify people for harsher treatment, for transfer to higher security facilities. The Honda's interior seemed to contract around Maggie as the implications crashed over her. Her grandmother, the resistance hero she'd just begun to imagine, had also been an unwitting collaborator. The complexity of it made her head spin, the moral landscape suddenly too treacherous to navigate. "She spent the rest of her life trying to make amends," David continued. "That's why she joined the real resistance networks after her escape. That's why she devoted herself to helping people disappear, to creating new identities, to protecting information that could save lives. She was trying to balance the scales." Through the rear window, Maggie could see no sign of the black sedan. They'd gained precious minutes, but she knew it wouldn't last. Modern surveillance had too many tools, too many ways to track a fleeing car through city streets. "The documents in that envelope," she said, her voice barely audible over the engine noise. "They don't just prove the resistance networks existed. They prove the government was using internees as intelligence assets." "Yes, and some of the families who profited from wartime contracts. Defense manufacturers, agricultural companies that got cheap labor, real estate developers who bought internee property at below-market prices. Their descendants are now in Congress, in corporate boardrooms, in positions where that kind of exposure could destroy them." Elena was staring at the envelope in Maggie's hands as if it were radioactive. "Jesus Christ, Maggie. No wonder they killed Walter. This isn't just about family secrets. This is about rewriting American history." The revelation crystallized in Maggie's mind with perfect, terrible clarity. She hadn't stumbled into a family mystery. She'd inherited a political time bomb, one that had been ticking quietly for 70 years while people like Walter Yamamoto stood guard over its secrets. The coordinates in her grandmother's message weren't just a treasure map. They were a dead man's switch, designed to activate only when the truth was in danger of being lost forever. "Pull over," she said suddenly. "What?" David's eyes found hers in the rearview mirror. "Maggie, we can't stop." "Pull over, now." The Honda slowed, coming to rest in the shadow of an overpass where the afternoon light couldn't penetrate. Around them, the city continued its normal rhythm, unaware that 3 people in a rust-colored car were holding evidence that could topple political dynasties. Maggie opened the envelope with steady hands. Inside were photographs, documents, and what appeared to be a detailed map of the Pacific Northwest, marked with dozens of locations. But it was the letter on top that made her breath catch, written in her grandmother's handwriting, but dated just 5 years ago. "That's impossible," Elena whispered, reading over her shoulder. "Your grandmother died in 1943. "No," Maggie said, the truth settling into her bones like winter cold. "She didn't." The letter was addressed to her specifically, written in the careful script of an elderly woman, my dearest Margaret. If you are reading this, then I am finally dead, and the time for hiding is over. I have watched you from a distance your entire life, forbidden by circumstance from being the grandmother you deserved. I know you struggle with your shop, your debts, your sense of purpose. Know this, you carry the strength of women who sacrificed everything for truth. The coordinates were just the beginning. What you do with what you've learned will determine whether our family's real story survives or dies with me. The letter was dated 5 years ago. 5 years ago, her grandmother had still been alive, watching her, knowing about her struggles. 5 years ago, an old woman who should have been dead for 70 years had been making plans for this exact moment. Everything Maggie thought she knew about her life, her family, her purpose, shifted like tectonic plates realigning. She wasn't just inheriting secrets. She was inheriting a mission that had cost her grandmother 80 years of exile from her own family. For several minutes, the only sound in the Honda was the distant rumble of traffic from the overpass above. Maggie held her grandmother's letter with hands that had stopped shaking, her mind processing the magnitude of what she'd inherited. 5 years ago, an old woman had been alive, watching, planning. 5 years ago, her grandmother had known this moment would come. "We need help," Elena said finally, her voice cutting through the silence. "We can't do this alone. We don't know who to trust, where to go, how to use this information without getting killed." David was studying the map that had been folded beneath the letter, his finger tracing routes between marked locations. "Actually, we might have more help than you think. Look at this." He spread the map across the dashboard, revealing a network of sites spanning from Vancouver to Northern California. Each location was marked with a small symbol, some circles, some triangles, some squares, and many had dates penciled beside them in his uncle's precise handwriting. "These aren't random," David continued. "Uncle Walter was updating your grandmother's network. These symbols, they're safe houses, document repositories, contact points. She didn't just preserve the evidence, she preserved the infrastructure to protect it." Maggie studied the map with growing amazement. Her grandmother hadn't been a lone guardian of secrets. She'd built something larger, something that had survived decades and adapted to new threats. The coordinates in the Bonsai had been just the entry point to a web of protection that stretched across the entire region. "Here." Elena pointed to a location marked with a star about 2 hours north of Seattle. "This one has yesterday's date next to it. Walter updated it yesterday, the day before he died." "That's impossible," David started, then stopped as understanding dawned. Unless he knew exactly when they were coming for him. Unless this was his final preparation. Maggie felt something shifting inside her chest, a loosening of the fear that had gripped her since Portland. Her grandmother hadn't just survived, she'd planned. Walter hadn't just died, he'd prepared. She wasn't alone and helpless in an impossible situation. She was part of something that had been built to endure exactly this kind of pressure. "We go north," she said, her voice stronger than it had been in hours. "But first, we need supplies. Cash, food, different clothes. They'll be looking for 3 people traveling together. There's an ATM 2 blocks from here," David said. "But using your cards, we'll tell them exactly where we are," Maggie finished. "I know. But I also know something they don't." She opened her wallet and pulled out a credit card she hadn't used in months, one linked to an account she'd opened under her maiden name when her husband's medical bills had forced her to separate their finances. "This card isn't connected to Margaret Chen. It's connected to Margaret Liu, and that identity has been dormant long enough that it might not be flagged in their initial searches." Elena stared at her. "You've been planning for this your whole life without knowing it." "Maybe." Maggie looked at her grandmother's letter again, at the careful words about carrying the strength of women who sacrificed everything for truth. "Or maybe this is what survival looks like when you're the granddaughter of someone who spent 80 years staying one step ahead of people who wanted her dead." They drove to a strip mall where Maggie withdrew the maximum daily amount from 2 different ATMs. $800 wouldn't last long, but it would buy them mobility and time. At a thrift store, they purchased different clothes, Elena trading her distinctive red coat for a nondescript brown jacket, David swapping his button-down for a flannel shirt that made him look like any other Pacific Northwest outdoorsman. Maggie chose a dark hoodie that would hide her graying hair and a pair of jeans that fit better than anything she'd bought in years. In the thrift store's cramped dressing room, changing into her new identity, Maggie caught sight of herself in the mirror. The frightened woman who had fled Portland 3 days ago was gone. In her place stood someone harder, more determined, someone who looked capable of carrying secrets that powerful people would kill for. "You look different," Elena said when they reconvened at the car. "I feel different." Maggie tucked the envelope inside her new jacket, close to her heart. "For the first time in years, I feel like I know what I'm supposed to be doing." As they prepared to leave Seattle behind, heading toward the starred location on her grandmother's map, Maggie realized that everything had changed. She was no longer running from her family's secrets, she was running toward them. She wasn't a victim of circumstances beyond her control, she was an active participant in a story that had been unfolding for decades before her birth. The afternoon was fading to evening as they merged onto the interstate. Three unlikely allies bound together by inherited purpose and shared danger. Behind them, Seattle's skyline disappeared into the gathering dusk. Ahead lay answers that might finally make sense of 80 years of carefully guarded truth. The interstate stretched ahead through the darkening Pacific Northwest landscape, flanked by towering evergreens that seemed to absorb what little light remained of the day. Maggie watched the mile markers pass, each one carrying them further from the safety of anonymity and closer to whatever waited at the starred coordinates on her grandmother's map. The envelope pressed against her ribs with each breath, a constant reminder of the weight she now carried. "Tell me about the other locations," she said, spreading the map across her lap while David drove. "If we're walking into some kind of final confrontation, I need to understand what my grandmother built." David glanced at the map in the rearview mirror. "From what Uncle Walter told me, she started small after the war. Safe houses for people who needed to disappear, war brides escaping abusive marriages, former internees who couldn't return to their old communities, people whose cooperation with various intelligence agencies had made them targets. She was protecting collaborators?" Elena's voice carried a note of judgment that made Maggie's stomach clench. "She was protecting survivors," David corrected gently. "People who'd made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. Your grandmother understood that survival sometimes required moral compromises that looked like betrayal to people who'd never faced those choices." Maggie studied the symbols scattered across the map, trying to imagine her grandmother as a young woman, building this network one connection at a time. How did she fund it? How did she keep it running for so many decades? That's the part Uncle Walter never fully explained. But he hinted that some of the people she helped went on to positions of influence: business leaders, politicians, federal employees who owed their lives or their freedom to her networks. They provided resources, intelligence, protection. The implications settled over Maggie like a heavy blanket. Her grandmother hadn't just preserved evidence of historical crimes, she'd built an ongoing conspiracy of protection that had evolved with the times. The starred location ahead wasn't just a hiding place for documents, it was the nerve center of something that had been operating in the shadows for 80 years. "They know," she said suddenly, the realization hitting her with crystalline clarity. "The people hunting us, they don't just want to bury the past, they're trying to destroy something that's still active, still dangerous to them." Elena turned in her seat. "What do you mean?" "Think about it. If this was just about historical documents, they'd have left us alone. Who's going to believe some crazy story about government surveillance in internment camps? Who would even care about 80-year-old evidence?" Maggie's voice gained strength as the pieces clicked together. "But if those documents are connected to a network that's still gathering intelligence, still protecting people, still capable of exposing current corruption, then we're not just carrying evidence," David finished grimly. "We're carrying the keys to an active resistance operation that's been documenting criminal activity for 3 generations." The Honda suddenly felt very small and very exposed on the darkening highway. Behind them, headlights appeared and disappeared, any one of which could belong to their pursuers. Ahead, the starred location beckoned with promises of answers that might be more dangerous than ignorance. Maggie thought about her shop in Portland, already lost to her now. She thought about the medical bills that had driven her to that storage auction, the desperation that had made her bid $300 she couldn't afford. 4 days ago, her biggest problem had been bankruptcy. Now she was carrying evidence that could topple political dynasties, traveling toward a confrontation with forces that had already killed to protect their secrets. "I could have lived my whole life without knowing any of this," she said quietly. "I could have gone bankrupt, lost the shop, moved in with my cousin in Sacramento, and spent my remaining years as a bitter woman who never understood why her life had been so hard." "But you didn't," Elena said. "You kept fighting. You went to that auction. You opened that bonsai. You chose to follow the clues instead of running away. Did I choose? Or was I always going to end up here?" Maggie looked at the map again, at the careful notations in her grandmother's handwriting, the recent updates in Walter's precise script. How much of what feels like choice is actually just inherited obligation playing out exactly as it was designed to? The philosophical question hung in the air as they passed a sign indicating their exit was 15 miles ahead. Whatever waited at the starred location would determine whether Maggie's inheritance was a gift of empowerment or a carefully constructed trap that had taken 80 years to spring. "There's something else," David said, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. "Uncle Walter's final message. He said if we made it this far, if we actually reached the coordinates, there would be a choice to make. We could take the evidence and disappear into the protection network forever, or we could use it to fight back. But once we choose, there's no changing our minds. We either become part of the conspiracy or we become its final weapon." The headlights behind them were definitely following now, maintaining exactly the same distance for the past 10 miles. Maggie's heart hammered against her ribs as she watched the pursuing headlights in the side mirror. They were no longer random traffic, the distance too precise, the timing too consistent. "How long until our exit?" 12 minutes, David said, his voice tight with concentration. "Maybe less if I push it." "Don't push it. We can't afford to get pulled over." Maggie's mind raced through everything she'd learned, every skill she'd developed running her antique business, every hard-won lesson from years of surviving on the margins. "Elena, check the map. Are there alternate routes to the coordinates?" Elena spread the map wider, tracing roads with her finger. "There's a secondary road that branches off about 3 miles past our exit. It's longer, more winding, but it connects to the same general area. That's our backup." Maggie folded her grandmother's letter carefully and tucked it back into the envelope. "But first, we're going to find out exactly who's following us." "Maggie, that's insane," David started. "No, hiding forever is insane. Running blindly toward coordinates we don't understand, while being hunted by people whose capabilities we can't measure, that's insane." She felt the same clarity that had guided her through her husband's illness, through the financial collapse that followed, through every crisis that had taught her the difference between reactive fear and strategic thinking. "We need information, and I have an idea." The exit ramp appeared ahead, a gentle curve disappearing into darkness between towering pines. David took it at precisely the speed limit, the Honda's tires whispering against wet asphalt. Behind them, the pursuing vehicle followed at the same calculated distance. There, Maggie pointed to a 24-hour gas station blazing with fluorescent light. "Pull in like we're stopping for fuel. Park near the building where the security cameras can see us clearly, and then we become hunters instead of prey." David pulled into the station, choosing a pump that offered clear sight lines in multiple directions. The pursuing car, a dark SUV with tinted windows, continued past the station but turned into a fast food parking lot directly across the street. Amateur mistake, Maggie thought. They were trying to maintain visual contact, but they'd also made themselves visible. "One person in the driver's seat," Elena reported, squinting through the darkness. "I can't see if there are passengers." Maggie stepped out of the Honda and began pumping gas with deliberate slowness, using the time to study their surroundings. The station sat at a crossroads where the highway met county routes heading in 4 directions. Dense forest pressed close on 3 sides, but to the east, she could see the lights of a small town scattered through the valley below. 2 minutes, she called to David. loud enough that anyone listening would hear. "I need to use the restroom, then we can get back on the road." Inside the gas station, she approached the clerk, a young man with multiple piercings and the weary look of someone working the night shift to pay for college. "I need a favor," she said quietly. "There's a car following us in the lot across the street. Dark SUV. If I give you $50, will you call that number in exactly 10 minutes and report a suspicious vehicle loitering on their property?" The clerk looked through the windows at the SUV, then at the $50 bill Maggie placed on the counter. "You running from an abusive ex or something?" "Something like that." "Make it 20 minutes, he said, pocketing the money. "Give you more time to get wherever you're going." Back outside, Maggie made a show of buying snacks and checking her phone before getting into the passenger seat. "Drive toward town," she instructed David. "Not toward our actual destination. We're going to use their surveillance against them." The Honda pulled back onto the county road, heading east into the valley. Within seconds, the SUV emerged from the fast food lot and resumed its pursuit. But now Maggie was ready for them. "Here's what we know," she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "They're close enough to follow us visually, which means they don't have sophisticated tracking on our vehicle. They're trying to stay hidden, which suggests they want to see where we're going rather than simply stopping us. And they're using a single vehicle, which means they're either overconfident or understaffed." Elena stared at her. "Where did you learn to think like this? 20 years of dealing with estate sales where family members are fighting over inheritance." Maggie surprised herself with a short laugh. "You learn to read people, to anticipate their moves, to know when someone's desperate enough to do something stupid." The lights of the small town grew brighter as they descended into the valley. Behind them, the SUV maintained its careful distance, unaware that its quarry had transformed from panicked refugees into strategic operatives. Everything Walter had taught her, everything her grandmother's letter had revealed, everything she'd learned about survival and purpose over the past 4 days, it all crystallized into cold determination. The ultimate test wasn't waiting at the starred coordinates. It was happening right now, on this dark road, with everything she'd inherited hanging in the balance. Maggie's pulse synchronized with the Honda's engine as they reached the town's main street, a collection of dark storefronts and flickering streetlights that offered both opportunity and exposure. The SUV hung back, probably assuming they were stopping for the night at one of the 2 motels bracketing the small business district. "Turn left at the next intersection," she instructed David, her voice carrying the quiet authority she'd developed during her husband's final months in the hospital. "Drive through the residential area like we're looking for an address." The Honda moved slowly through streets lined with modest houses, most dark except for porch lights and the blue glow of televisions. Behind them, the SUV followed at what its driver probably thought was a safe distance. But Maggie had spent years evaluating the contents of strangers' lives, learning to see patterns others missed, and she could read the hesitation in their pursuers' movements. "They're not professionals," she said with growing certainty. "At least, not the kind who do this regularly. They're staying too close, in residential areas, following our exact route instead of paralleling. Whoever hired them picked people who are competent enough to be dangerous but inexperienced enough to make mistakes." Elena gripped the door handle as David navigated a series of turns designed to test their theory. "How is that good news?" "Because it means they're probably not expecting us to fight back." Maggie opened her purse and inventoried its contents with new eyes. Pepper spray she'd carried for years but never used, a small LED flashlight, her car keys with their heavy metal fob. Items that had seemed mundane hours ago now felt like potential weapons. And because if they're not professionals, they're probably scared too. David caught her eye in the rearview mirror. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking about something my grandmother wrote, about choosing the moment of confrontation instead of letting others choose it for you." Maggie's fingers found the envelope inside her jacket, drawing strength from the connection to a woman who had survived much worse than this. "Take the next right. There's a small park at the end of this street. I saw it on the map. We're going to end this game of follow the leader." The park was exactly what she'd hoped for. An open space with multiple exit routes, bounded by trees that would provide cover but not concealment for vehicles. David pulled into the gravel parking area and turned off the engine. The sudden silence felt like held breath. "Now we wait," Maggie said, surprised by her own calmness. 4 days ago, a difficult customer had been enough to ruin her entire afternoon. Now she was preparing to confront armed strangers with nothing but determination and improvised tactics. "They have to decide whether to follow us in or wait for us to come out. Either choice gives us information we can use." The SUV appeared at the park entrance within 30 seconds, confirming that they'd been made. But instead of entering, it stopped at the road, engine running, caught between competing tactical imperatives. They want to maintain surveillance, but they don't want to trap themselves in a confined space, David observed. Smart enough to recognize the disadvantage, not confident enough to risk direct confrontation. Elena's voice was tight with controlled fear. "So what do we do? Sit here all night?" "No." Maggie opened her door, the sound sharp in the night air. "We use their hesitation against them." Before David could protest, she stepped out of the Honda and began walking directly toward the park entrance, toward the SUV. Not running, not hiding, but moving with the measured pace of someone who had made a decision and intended to see it through. The SUV's headlights illuminated her approach, and she could see the driver's silhouette shifting in apparent confusion. This wasn't how prey was supposed to behave. Behind her, she heard David and Elena getting out of the Honda, flanking her at careful angles that would make them harder targets if shooting started. At 50 feet from the SUV, Maggie stopped and raised her voice. "My name is Margaret Chen. I think you're looking for something that belonged to my grandmother. If you want it, you can ask for it instead of following us around like criminals." The SUV's engine revved once, a mechanical growl that might have been intended as intimidation. But the driver didn't advance, didn't retreat, didn't respond to her challenge. The hesitation confirmed everything she'd suspected about their psychological profile. "You're scared," she called out, taking another step forward. "You're scared because you don't really know what you're looking for or how dangerous it might be. You're scared because whoever hired you told you just enough to make you paranoid, but not enough to make you effective." The driver's door opened. A figure emerged from the SUV, medium height, dark clothing, something metallic glinting in the streetlight. Not a gun, Maggie realized with relief, but keys or a phone. The person stood beside the vehicle for a long moment, as if gathering courage or waiting for instructions. Then they spoke, and Maggie's blood turned to ice water. "Hello, Margaret. We need to talk about what you found in that storage unit, and about what happens to people who dig too deeply into family secrets that were supposed to stay buried forever." The voice was familiar, impossible, but undeniably familiar. It was her cousin Janet's voice. Maggie's legs nearly buckled as the impossible registered in her mind. Janet, her mother's sister's daughter, the one who had sent Christmas cards every year, who had offered her the spare bedroom in Sacramento when the medical bills mounted too high. Janet, who had helped plan their mother's funeral, who knew every family story, every shared memory. "That's not possible," Maggie whispered. But even as she spoke, she recognized the slight lisp that had marked Janet's speech since childhood, the way she emphasized certain syllables when she was nervous. "I'm sorry, Maggie." Janet stepped into the full glow of the streetlight, and there was no denying it. The same round face, the same graying brown hair, the same wire-rimmed glasses. But something fundamental had changed in her expression, a hardness that made her look like a stranger wearing Janet's features. "I really didn't want it to come to this." Behind Maggie, she heard David's sharp intake of breath, Elena's muffled curse. The betrayal cut deeper than fear, deeper than the physical danger they faced. This wasn't just about pursuing strangers anymore. This was about family turning against family, about trust becoming a weapon. "How long?" Maggie's voice emerged steady despite the earthquake in her chest. "How long have you been watching me?" "Since the storage auction." Janet's hands remained visible, but Maggie could see the tension in her posture, the way she kept glancing at the Honda, as if calculating distances and escape routes. "I've been trying to protect you, trying to steer you away from this path. But you wouldn't listen. You kept digging." "Protect me?" The rage that followed the shock was white-hot and clarifying. "You killed Walter Nakamura. You've been terrorizing us for days. You call that protection? Walter killed himself with his obsession. All I did was try to retrieve what he'd stolen before you got hurt." Janet took a step closer, and Maggie could see tears on her cheeks, real emotion warring with whatever duty had brought her here. "Do you have any idea what you're carrying? What it could do to our family if it becomes public? I know it could save my business. I know it contains evidence of crimes that destroyed people's lives." Maggie felt her grandmother's letter against her chest like armor. "I know it's important enough that someone's willing to murder for it. It's not about the historical evidence, Maggie. It's about the active networks. The people who are still alive, still vulnerable." Janet's voice cracked with genuine anguish. "Our grandmother didn't just document past crimes. She created an ongoing intelligence operation that's been blackmailing government officials for 80 years. If those files go public, dozens of people die. Families get destroyed. Good people who've been forced into impossible situations." The words hit Maggie like physical blows. She thought of her grandmother's careful handwriting, the starred locations, the sense that she'd inherited something larger than historical documents. But this transformed everything she'd believed about her legacy from heroic resistance into systematic corruption. "You're lying," she said, but doubt had already begun eating at her certainty. "The congressman whose career your grandmother saved in 1953, he's been feeding intelligence to foreign governments for 60 years because he knows she documented his draft dodging. The federal judge who owes his position to her networks, he's been throwing cases to protect other blackmail victims." Janet's words came faster now, desperate and pleading. "It started as justice, but it became something monstrous, and it's still growing." Elena stepped forward, her voice cutting through the emotional manipulation with surgical precision. "Even if that's true, murdering people to cover it up makes you worse than whatever you're trying to prevent. No one was supposed to die." Janet's composure finally cracked completely. "Walter was supposed to hand over the files quietly. You were supposed to accept the money I offered and walk away. This was supposed to end with everyone safe." But Maggie was no longer listening to the justifications. She was thinking about choices, about the moment her grandmother had decided to hide evidence in a bonsai tree, about Walter's decision to protect that evidence, even unto death, about her own decision to open the storage unit, to follow the clues, to keep fighting when surrender would have been easier. "You're asking me to sacrifice everything I've learned about my family, everything I've inherited, to protect a system that's been poisoning people for decades," she said quietly. "You want me to give up my grandmother's real legacy, her courage, her refusal to let injustice stand, to preserve the thing that legacy became." Janet raised her hand, and Maggie saw the phone she'd mistaken for keys. "One call and this ends. The files disappear, you get enough money to save your business, and everyone walks away alive. That's the sacrifice I'm asking for. Your curiosity in exchange for everyone's safety." The moment stretched between them like a bridge over an abyss. Behind Janet, Maggie could see other headlights approaching. Reinforcements or federal agents, people who would make the choice for her if she hesitated too long. She thought of her shop in Portland, already lost. She thought of the medical bills, the financial ruin, the desperate auction that had started everything. Then she thought of Walter Nakamura dying alone to protect the truth. "No," she said, and felt her grandmother's strength flowing through the word like electricity through a wire. "The real sacrifice isn't giving up the truth. It's giving up the comfortable lie that family loyalty matters more than justice." Janet's finger moved toward the phone, and Maggie knew the killing would start again. The approaching headlights blazed through the park entrance like spotlights, and Maggie watched Janet's finger freeze over her phone as 3 federal vehicles surrounded the SUV in a choreographed maneuver that spoke of careful planning and patient surveillance. "FBI, hands visible!" The voice boomed through a loudspeaker as agents emerged from the vehicles with weapons drawn. Janet's phone clattered to the asphalt as she raised both hands, her face cycling through confusion, terror, and something that might have been relief. Maggie stood motionless in the center of the chaos. David and Elena flanking her as federal agents moved with practiced efficiency. One of them, a woman in her 40s with graying temples and eyes that missed nothing, approached with her weapon lowered but ready. "Miss Chen? Agent Sarah Martinez, FBI. We've been monitoring this situation for the past 72 hours. Monitoring? Maggie's voice sounded hollow in her own ears. The adrenaline that had sustained her through the confrontation was draining away, leaving behind bone-deep exhaustion and the realization that nothing she'd believed about her family would ever be simple again. Agent Martinez nodded toward Janet, who was being handcuffed with gentle professionalism by two other agents. "Your cousin has been under federal investigation for 18 months. Financial crimes, obstruction of justice, conspiracy to commit murder. When Walter Nakamura's death triggered automated alerts in our system, we realized she was escalating." "Automated alerts?" Elena stepped closer, her journalist's instincts still functioning despite everything they'd witnessed. "Mr. Nakamura was a federal informant," Martinez explained. "He'd been feeding us information about the blackmail network your cousin described, but not to protect it, to dismantle it. His death was meant to look natural, but our forensics team found evidence of coercion." Maggie watched as Janet was placed in the back of a federal vehicle, their eyes meeting through the window for one devastating moment. The cousin who had sent birthday cards and Christmas presents, who had offered comfort during their mother's funeral, who had carried family secrets that had curdled into poison over 8 decades. "The files your grandmother created," Martinez continued, "they're evidence in dozens of federal cases. Corruption that's been metastasizing through government institutions since World War II. What started as resistance became exploitation, and what began as justice became its own form of tyranny." "So, everything Janet said was true?" David's question carried the weight of moral exhaustion. "Partially. The blackmail network exists. People have been compromised, but dismantling it through legal channels, using your grandmother's documentation as evidence rather than leverage, that's how healing actually happens." Martinez turned back to Maggie with something approaching gentleness. "Your decision tonight, refusing the cover-up, that's what makes prosecuting these crimes possible." The federal vehicles began departing with their prisoner, leaving behind a silence that felt heavier than the preceding chaos. Maggie found herself sitting on a park bench without remembering the decision to sit, staring at her hands as if they belonged to someone else. "My grandmother," she said quietly. "She documented crimes to prevent their repetition. But somewhere along the way, the documentation became the crime." Elena sat beside her, close enough to offer comfort without demanding conversation. David remained standing, his expression distant as he processed the night's revelations. "Power corrupts even resistance," he said finally. "Your grandmother fought injustice with the only tools she had, but those tools outlived their original purpose, and other people used them for their own ends." Agent Martinez approached once more, carrying a manila envelope. "These are copies of everything we need for prosecution. The originals, your inheritance, they belong to you. What you do with them now that the criminal investigation is resolved, that's your choice." Maggie accepted the envelope with hands that had stopped shaking. Inside were photocopies of her grandmother's careful documentation, decades of evidence that would reshape historical understanding of wartime collaboration and post-war corruption. But also the beginning of accountability, the start of justice delayed but not denied. "My business," she said, the words feeling strange after everything that had happened. "My shop, the medical bills, none of that matters anymore, does it?" "The families of blackmail victims have established a compensation fund," Martinez explained, "for people harmed by the network's activities. And there are publishers, historians, documentary filmmakers who would pay substantial licensing fees for access to these materials. Your financial troubles aren't necessarily permanent." As the federal vehicles disappeared into the night, Maggie stood in the park where her old life had ended and something new had begun. The woman who had bid desperately on Storage Unit 47 4 days ago, driven by financial panic and fading hope, no longer existed. In her place stood someone who had chosen justice over safety, truth over family loyalty, complexity over comfortable lies. The real inheritance wasn't money or property. It was the knowledge that every generation faces the choice between perpetuating systems of harm or breaking them, regardless of the cost. The drive back to Portland took 3 hours through the pre-dawn darkness, but Maggie barely noticed the passing miles. David handled the driving while Elena dozed fitfully in the passenger seat, leaving Maggie alone with her thoughts in the back seat, the manila envelope resting against her chest like a talisman. Everything looked different now. The highway signs, the distant city lights, even her own reflection in the window. She was returning to the same physical world she'd left 4 days ago, but she felt like an explorer coming back from a foreign country, carrying maps that would forever change how she navigated familiar territory. When they reached the warehouse district where her shop waited, the morning sun was painting the Portland sky in shades of pearl and rose. David pulled up to the curb outside Maggie's Antiques, and the three of them sat in silence for a moment, none quite ready to acknowledge that their shared journey was ending. "The bonsai," Maggie said suddenly, remembering. "It's still in my shop. After everything we've learned, I don't even know if I can bear to look at it." "Maybe that's exactly why you should," Elena replied gently. "It's not just evidence anymore. It's a living thing that survived everything your grandmother endured. That has to mean something." Inside the shop, dust motes danced in the morning light streaming through windows that hadn't been cleaned in weeks. The familiar chaos of accumulated treasures, furniture she'd been meaning to refinish, jewelry awaiting appraisal, books stacked in precarious towers, felt like returning to a childhood bedroom after years away. The bonsai sat where she'd left it, its ancient branches reaching toward the light with patient dignity. The cut in its trunk had already begun to heal over, new growth sealing the wound that had revealed so many secrets. "Hello, old friend," Maggie whispered, running her fingers along the smooth bark. For the first time since opening the storage unit, she felt genuine peace. This tree had sheltered her grandmother's courage for 80 years. Now it could simply be what it had always been, a living testament to endurance. Her phone buzzed with a text message, and she almost ignored it until she saw her daughter Sarah's name. "Mom, are you okay? I had the strangest dream that you were in some kind of trouble. Call me when you get this." Maggie stared at the screen, realizing she had a choice to make. She could craft a careful explanation that downplayed the danger, that protected Sarah from worrying about secrets and conspiracies and family members who had chosen darkness over light. The old Maggie, the one who had inherited her mother's talent for keeping painful truths hidden, would have found some comfortable lie. Instead, she dialed Sarah's number. "Mom? Thank God, I was about to drive up there." "Sarah, I need to tell you some things about our family. About your great-grandmother, and about choices we didn't know we'd inherited. It's complicated and difficult, and I don't have all the answers yet. Are you in trouble? Do you need money?" The question that would have devastated her 4 days ago now made Maggie smile. "Actually, sweetheart, I think the money problems are going to resolve themselves. But I need something more important than financial help. I need to know if you're willing to hear stories that might change how you think about where you come from." "Mom, you're scaring me." "I'm not trying to scare you. I'm trying to trust you with the truth, even when it's messy. Your great-grandmother was a remarkable woman who made impossible choices during impossible times. Some of those choices created consequences that lasted for 80 years. And now we get to decide what to do with that legacy." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Sarah spoke again, her voice carried a new maturity. "Tell me everything." As Maggie began the story, starting with the storage auction and working forward through bonsai trees and hidden documents and family members who weren't who they seemed, she felt another piece of her old self falling away. The woman who had protected her daughter from complexity was being replaced by someone who trusted her child with difficult truths. David and Elena had left quietly while she was on the phone, understanding that this conversation needed privacy, but they'd left notes, David's with his contact information and an offer to help with the historical research, Elena's with details about documentary filmmakers who might be interested in the story. When Maggie finished explaining everything to Sarah, her daughter was quiet for several minutes. "So you chose justice over family loyalty," Sarah said finally, "even when it meant losing the cousin who'd been kind to us." I chose the kind of family loyalty that holds us accountable to our better angels instead of our comfortable lies, Maggie replied. Your great-grandmother started that choice 80 years ago. I just finally learned how to finish it. The morning light had grown stronger while they talked, illuminating the shop that had once represented financial desperation and now felt like a sanctuary for new beginnings. I want to come home, Sarah said quietly. Not just for a visit. I want to help you figure out what comes next. Maggie felt tears she hadn't known she was holding back spill down her cheeks. You have your life in Seattle, your job. I have a job I can do remotely, and a mother who just inherited the kind of family history that changes everything. Besides, Sarah's voice carried a smile that Maggie could hear through the phone. Someone needs to help you deal with documentary filmmakers and publishers. You're brilliant with antiques, but you've never been good at contracts. After they hung up, Maggie sat in the golden morning light filtering through her shop windows, surrounded by the accumulated treasures of other people's lives, and realized she was no longer afraid. The medical bills that had driven her to that desperate storage auction would be paid. The shop that had represented failure would continue, but transformed, not just a repository for forgotten objects, but a place where stories found their voices again. She walked to the bonsai and carefully moved it to the front window, where passers-by could see its ancient dignity. A small placard, handwritten on aged paper, would tell visitors that this tree had survived internment camps and family secrets, had sheltered courage, and witnessed the long journey from resistance to justice. Some stories, she thought, were meant to be shared. The bell above her door chimed, and Maggie looked up to see Elena returning with coffee and pastries from the bakery down the street. Couldn't stay away? Maggie asked. Actually, I have a confession. Elena set down the coffee and pulled out her phone. I've been thinking about what Agent Martinez said about documentary filmmakers. My editor wants me to write the story, but I keep thinking it deserves something more comprehensive than a newspaper series. She showed Maggie an email thread she'd been composing while sitting in her car outside. There's a production company that specializes in historical documentaries. They're interested, but they want to know if you'd be willing to participate, not just as a source, but as a partner. Your grandmother's story, your story, they're part of something larger about how families carry secrets and how those secrets shape history. Maggie read the emails over Elena's shoulder, marveling at how the journalist had managed to capture both the human drama and historical significance of what they'd uncovered. The production company's response was enthusiastic, professional, and respectful. They understood they were dealing with family trauma as much as historical revelation. 6 months ago, the idea of strangers knowing my private business would have terrified me, Maggie said. Now it feels like the whole point. What's the use of inheriting courage if you don't use it? Elena smiled. There's something else. David called while I was getting coffee. He's been in touch with colleagues at the Japanese American National Museum. They want to create an exhibit about wartime resistance networks, not just the heroic version, but the complicated truth about how survival sometimes requires moral compromises. Your grandmother's documentation would be the centerpiece. The scope of it was overwhelming. Her desperate bid on a storage unit had unlocked not just family secrets, but a piece of American history that museums and filmmakers and publishers wanted to preserve and share. The woman who had once measured her worth in monthly sales figures now found herself custodian of a legacy that would outlive her by generations. Her phone buzzed with another text, this one from Sarah, giving notice today. We'll be home by the weekend. We have work to do. Maggie laughed aloud, the sound echoing through her shop like music. The daughter she'd tried to protect from life's complexities was choosing to dive headfirst into the most complex situation their family had ever faced. But that choice felt right in ways that careful protection never had. As Elena left to file her story and Maggie prepared to open the shop for the day, she found herself moving differently through the familiar space. The antiques surrounding her, the carved wooden boxes, the faded photographs, the jewelry that had outlived its owners, no longer felt like mere merchandise. They were stories waiting for the right person to claim them, connections between past and present that had the power to change lives. She unlocked the front door and flipped the sign from closed to open, then stood in the doorway watching Portland wake up around her. The warehouse district that had once felt like exile now seemed like exactly where she belonged, a neighborhood built on transformation, where old things found new purposes and forgotten stories discovered their voices. The bonsai in the window caught the morning light, its leaves rustling gently in the breeze from the open door. After 80 years of keeping secrets, it was finally free to simply grow.